Hello. When we think of children in Victorian art, we probably think of sentimental images of well-clothed and well-fed children, like this painting by John Everett Millais called Bubbles. But was this an accurate portrayal of what it was like for children in the Victorian period? Remember, the Industrial Revolution swept the country, and we think of great engineers like George Stephenson and Isambard Kingdom Brunel, but 40% of the population were under 15, and children started work at 4 or 5. So a large part of the success of the Industrial Revolution was built using a vast, cheap, expendable resource, namely children, like this one. The idea we have today of childhood being a special protected stage of life gradually developed during the Victorian period. And it's this that I want to talk about today, how that development took place. I start with rich children versus poor, then country versus town. I look at workhouses, health and mortality, and finish with the Victorian family. The talk proceeds roughly chronologically from the terrible conditions at the start of the century to the slightly better ones at the end. So let's begin with a painting that shows what appear to be two relatively well-off children in Newcastle, one of the centres of the Industrial Revolution. This is by William Bell Scott, and it's called, the full title is In the 19th Century, the Northumbrians Show the World What Can Be Done with Iron and Coal. It was painted about the middle of the period we're talking about and shows the white heat of the Industrial Revolution. It's all about noise, smoke and energy. We see muscular blacksmiths pounding a white hot steel ingot, and the painting celebrates the national importance of the iron and coal industries around Newcastle. Behind them in the background is Robert Stephenson's high-level bridge, opened by Queen Victoria a few years before, and on the bridge is a locomotive whose plans are propped on the floor at the bottom right down here. But I want to consider the two children. First, the boy over here is holding what looks like a Davy lamp, but it could be a Stephenson safety lamp. And in the other hand, he's holding a mine pony's whip, and under his arm, a light snack for lunch. Of course, he's dressed too well to go down the pit, and I'll be showing you a photograph of some pit boys later. I think, in fact, both of these children have been smartened up for the painting. The girl is sitting waiting with her dog, holding lunch for her father and sitting on an Armstrong gun barrel. You might have heard of William Armstrong. He was an arms manufacturer. And if you visited Craigside, the National Trust property in Northumberland, you'll be well aware of what he did. Now, the girl is the only one looking at us, and I think she represents the future. She's experiencing childhood as an ever-lengthening interval between being a toddler and a paid or unpaid member of the workforce. Before this date, such an interval scarcely existed for working class children. And I think it's an encouraging message because in front of her, there's a sunbeam hitting the floor. Now, I know that she's at school because although you can't see it in this reproduction, she's holding in her lap a school arithmetic book. So this suggests she's represents the intellectual possibilities of the future. Her newfound freedom and education mean that she may well threaten the patriarchal society that's around her when she grows up. Now, the world was changing very quickly. In 1840, that's 20 years before this painting, 60% of women were illiterate. But by 1860, it was only 40%. And in another 20 years, the 1880 Education Act made education compulsory for all children between the ages of 5 and 10. Although in fact, this law was often ignored by poorer parents who needed the income from child labour. But it did mean that children were guaranteed an education in law if not in fact. So, in some ways, this painting represents a turning point in the creation of what we regard as childhood today. But we need to step back. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back nearly 70 years and see how children were regarded in 1793. We see two wealthy children, and a girl is giving a coin to the poor boy. This, incidentally, was a common subject for artists, as it appealed to the fashion at the time for sentiment, that is, a heightened feeling of sympathy and pity that appeared in romantic poetry, and feeling was regarded as a surer guide to truth than reason. But in this case, there's more to the painting than meets the eye. It's essentially propaganda in favour of slavery. The father of these wealthy children was Sir Francis Ford of Ember Court, Thames Ditton, and he owned a plantation in Barbados, and he was also an MP and argued in Parliament in favour of slavery, his argument being that he treated his slaves in Barbados better than the poor who lived in the slums of England. So this painting is saying that he personally cares for the poor of England as well as his slaves in Barbados. By the way, the artist William Beechey is little known today, but at the time he was the leading portrait painter, along with the more flamboyant Sir Thomas Lawrence. You might wonder about Thomas Gainsborough and Sir Joshua Reynolds. They were the leading painters, but they'd died a few years previously. Children were starting to be seen differently as early as the late 18th century. Previously, the religious belief was that all children, in fact, all of us, are born with original sin. But the Romantic poets believed that children were born without sin. They were born innocent and were corrupted by society. Nevertheless, it took the whole of the Victorian period for laws to be introduced to actually protect children, possibly, speaking cynically, because MPs were also the factory owners who exploited child labour. Now, an important distinction was made during the Victorian period between the deserving and the undeserving poor. So they obviously thought that this boy here was one of the deserving poor. So let's look more closely at the distinction between the two. And this is a scene, a rural scene by William Collins, the father of the novelist Wilkie Collins, called Rustic Civility, painted in 1833. And we see three children holding open a gate for a gentleman on a horse. And the gentleman on the horse is indicated by his shadow that I'm indicating down here on the ground. The boy is touching his forelock out of respect for the gentleman. And incidentally, this painting is not ironic. There's no joking here. Collins was a high Tory and opposed to the Reform Bill that had been passed the previous year, the bill that gave more men the vote. What this picture is saying, therefore, is that the poor don't need the vote, as they are well off, have leisure time, as these children are unusually being shown playing, not working, and the poor are naturally subservient to their betters. Collins believed the poor wouldn't know what to do with their vote anyway, but they were deserving of our pity and charity. The Victorian view is made clearer, I think, and best summed up by the hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, that you might know, but let me remind you of the lines. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. But there was a dilemma here, because the Victorians were also great believers in self-help. They believed anyone could better themselves through honest hard work, yet the poor seemed to be ordained to be that way by God. The solution to this dilemma was solved by the Victorians by distinguishing between what they called the deserving and undeserving poor. The deserving poor were those who worked hard, were teetotalers, didn't complain and tried to better themselves. The undeserving poor were lazy, drank, and deserved their poverty, but not our charity. The first could help themselves and should be assisted by charity, but the undeserving poor had to accept their fate as determined by God. Well, let's go into the farmhouse and look at a more jolly occasion. A happy moment in the farmhouse, painted by David Wilkie in 1806, called The Blind Fiddler, shows how even a poor family can enjoy themselves and be moved by music. As you can see, the two young children in the centre are showing their rapt attention to the music, and the boy on the right is having fun, pretending to play a pair of bellows. But as is often the case, there's another level to this picture. When it was exhibited at the Royal Academy, some critics pointed out the bust on the shelf above. Let me mark it for you there, representing a dissenting minister. This means the family were nonconformists and so would have been suspicious of any pleasure. The painting therefore shows the power of music to stir the passions of even those suspicious of pleasure, and that added to the subtlety and humour of the picture. But down on the farm, things were changing quickly. In 1806, Britain was at war with France. Napoleon had blockaded all the European ports to restrict food to Britain. So farms had to increase their productivity to feed the nation. One aspect of that was that fields, common land, fields were fenced in, enclosed, and so could no longer be used by the rural poor to grow food. So there was more hunger. The agricultural revolution also brought with it increased automation to improve productivity, and so fewer farm workers were needed. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was opening up factories around the country, and workers were moving from the countryside to the towns where they could earn higher wages. So let's look at work, but let's look at children at work. And the children at the top are children who work down the mines, and that's the way they dress to work down the mines. And at the bottom, there's two boys working in a textile factory. The conditions were appalling, and we know that from government reports, but recent research has found testimonies written by children. And I thought I would illustrate this picture by reading some of those testimonies. Now, the children who worked in the mines started at 4 in the morning and worked till 4 in the afternoon. A government report produced in 1842 described the terrible conditions, although I believe they were played down because many MPs owned mines and they didn't want the numerous injuries and deaths to be recorded. But one, as the government inspector called her, one pretty little girl, Mary Davis, aged 6, was found fast asleep against a large stone underground. And after being wakened, she said, "I went to sleep because my lamp had gone out for want of oil. I was frightened, for someone had stolen my bread and cheese. I think it was the rats." Another little girl, Sarah Gooder, said, "Sometimes I sing, but never in the dark. I don't like being in the pit, I'm scared." The children often worked in the dark, and there were rats and cockroaches down there. Now, that government report of 1842 got a lot of publicity, but it turned out the biggest scandal was the revelation that women and girls worked topless down the mine because of the heat. So quickly in 1842, the same year, an act was passed that prohibited all underground work for women and girls. It also restricted boys to only be able to work down the mine if they were 10 or older. But it wasn't just the mines, other trades. For example, apprentices were treated like slaves. In fact, Charles Bacon, when he was 13, was auctioned as an apprentice. And he wrote later that he had read Uncle Tom's Cabin And as he stood in the auction waiting to be sold, he said he felt slavery existed in England as well. The first wave of factory workers were made up of orphans, the real life Oliver Twists. A child could be in a happy middle-class family one day, and if the parents died without leaving any money and there were no relatives, the child could be working in a factory the next day, like the boys in the photograph down below. A form of state-sponsored slavery, you might argue. Now, we mentioned the farm, and you might think children were better off there, but testimonies show child sexual abuse and cruelty. Agriculture was the largest employer in the first half of the century, and children would start work when they were 5 or 6. And one job young children were put on was to act as human scarecrows, long, hungry days in the field from dawn to dusk, hours of loneliness. One girl wrote later, "I cried all day, mother, 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 but she couldn't hear me." Now, some of you might be thinking, hard work never did anyone any harm, but actually it did. It permanently distorted young bodies and led to early deaths. Let me quote from a boy. He wrote, "By 7, I was driving a plough." And he continued by explaining how he had to carry a 40-pound horse halter and part of a plough a mile to the blacksmith, and it damaged his back for life. When planting a field, if a child straightened their back for relief, they were beaten. Many children died, and children reached adulthood with knocked knees, humpbacks from carrying heavy loads, and damaged pelvises from standing 14 hours a day. There were numerous industrial injuries, lost limbs, industrial diseases, and death. Girls working in a match factory, for example, suffered a particularly horrible disease known as phossy jaw. But let's move now from the factories, mines, and farms to town, as I must say something about the workhouses. This is a well-known painting by Luke Files called "Applicants for Admission to a Casual Ward." It was first exhibited at the Royal Academy, and it was so popular, a barrier had to be erected to keep back the crowds. Most critics praised the work for its lack of easy sentimentality, but other critics criticised it for the same reason, condemning its squalor and hopelessness and rejecting it as a suitable subject for a painting in an art gallery. The background to this, by the way, this was painted in 1874. The background is that workhouses were introduced in 1834 when a new poor law was introduced. Incidentally, the aim of the poor law was not to help the poor, it was to reduce the cost of looking after them. It introduced the idea of the workhouse, which was designed to be worse than the worst form of employment, and we've seen how bad that can be. The poor hated the workhouse as it split families. Women and men and children were kept in separate parts of the institutions. They might see each other at meal times, but weren't allowed to talk. So why are they queuing up here? Well, it's because they're starving and they're queuing to get in, to get a warmer night's sleep and some food. But even then it wasn't easy. They're not actually queuing outside the workhouse. The procedure was they first had to queue outside a police station for a ticket to admit them to the casual ward, that's the overnight ward of a workhouse. And they had to find a workhouse that had some free spaces available. And then they only got accommodation for one night. If they wanted another night, they had to go through the whole procedure again, queuing to get a ticket and then finding a workhouse. Even then, it was a fate many didn't wish to submit their families to, as I told you, it split them up. You might think this was the poorest of the poor in London, but there was actually an even lower level in the streets of London. This is a photograph from a book by John Thompson called Street Life in London, which is still in print, and I recommend the book. You might be wondering how childcare worked when poor mothers needed to work to feed their family. Well, the answer's shown here. This woman was called a crawler, and she often would look after babies all day. A crawler is a beggar who is so poor and weak from hunger that he or she can no longer beg, but relies on other beggars giving them food. And incidentally, begging was regarded as a profession that beggars were proud of. And so they would occasionally give crawlers money. And many crawlers were actually middle-class people who'd fallen on hard times. It could happen to anyone. There was no welfare, of course. They sat on hard stone steps day and night in wind and rain and snow and got little sleep. This woman, we know, looked after the baby from 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon for a cup of tea, which she didn't always get, she said. Now, all the 36 photographs in the book cover trades that operated in the street, such as cab drivers, flower sellers, sign painters, fishmongers, and so on. And each person whose photograph was taken was interviewed, and it provides a surprising insight into street life. This woman, for example, had dreams. She dreamt that she would be able to earn eventually a few shillings saved up from farthings and halfpennies and even pennies she was given. And she would use the money to travel to the hop fields of Kent when they were in season. And from the money she earned there, she reckoned she could earn about £1. She would come back, rent a room in order to get an address. And with an address, she could start work again. Her son could then get his clothes out of the pawn shop and get a job, and the family would be reunited. We don't know whether her dream ever came about, though. I wanted to talk now about health and lifespan and look more closely at child mortality. You can see here two large families, a poor family on the left and a wealthy family on the right. And both wealthy and poor, something between a quarter to a half in the slums of all children died before the age of 5. And this is part of the reason, and also the lack of contraception, why the average family was so large. And also for poor parents, a large family increased family income as children could be sent out to work when they were 4 or 5. And for wealthy families, having more children was just the expected norm. But things were changing as society got wealthier. Women who married in 1860, for example, would bear on average 6 children, but their grandchildren who married in 1910 would have on average 3 children. And it's thought that this reduction in the size of family was the increasing wealth of society, and partly that children are becoming seen less as economically dependent wage earners, but as the sacred child. That is, the increasing wealth of the nation went hand in hand with the creation of the modern idea of childhood. Before I carry on, though, there's an important point that I'd like to make about lifespan. You will often read that the average lifespan in 1850 was about 40, sometimes stated as 42. But this figure was massively skewed by the death of the under 5s. If a child could live to the age of 5, then their average lifespan was similar today. It was about 75 for men and slightly less, 73 for women, because of the dangers of childbirth. And somebody born in 1850, 1 in 10 of the people born in 1850 lived to be over 80. In fact, between 1850 and 1870, an analysis of census data shows that there was a golden age in England when, if you reached the age of 5, that's an important caveat, your lifespan was longer than it is today. And this was because of their diet and exercise. Modern degenerative diseases, heart attacks, diabetes, lung cancer, and so on, were extremely rare, almost unknown. Infections and death was very common. because they had no way of treating them. But after 1875, things changed. The diet changed, basically. Salted or corned beef, as it was called, arrived from Argentina. Sugar-laden condensed milk started to become available. Canned fruit in syrup and white bread were all introduced in this period. And by 1900, half the young men who volunteered for the Boer War were rejected as undernourished, and their teeth were so poor they couldn't chew vegetables, fruit, and nuts. So let's move on and look at what perhaps is the most, the lowest point of pain, suffering, and death of the 19th century. We are about halfway through my talk and halfway through the 19th century. This was painted in 1850 by George Frederick Watts, and it's called Irish Famine. The man in the picture stares out of us, stares out, still blaming us. Now, in the first half of the century, the poor were dependent on a good harvest, and as it happens, from about 1840 or 1850 onwards, the harvests in England were relatively good. The weather was good. In the bad famines, in the worst famines, people starved to death, and the worst of the 19th century was the Great Famine in Ireland, which was from 1846 to 1850, when 1 million people died of starvation. And to put that in perspective, it's more than all the British soldiers who died in World War I, and millions more, about up to a quarter of the Irish population emigrated. The cause was potato blight, which was the main food of the poor. But, and it's an important caveat, at this time, Ireland, that is, the English owners of the farms in Ireland, were still exporting 30 to 50 shiploads of food a day to England, more than enough to feed the entire Irish population. And remember, at this time, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And some historians, therefore, describe this as genocide. And of course, it eventually led to Irish independence in the next century. Medical treatment. I said I'd talk briefly about health. Well, it changed a lot during the century. At the beginning of the century, around 1800, doctors they would still be bleeding, encouraging vomiting, and in the extreme case, they would suggest prayer as the answer. But by the end of the century, in fact, introduced in 1895, the doctors even had x-rays. Medicines were being developed, anesthetics had been developed much earlier. There was a better understanding of how diseases spread. Now, this is showing a doctor sitting with his hand supporting his head because he's been sitting all night with a sick child, while the father, quite difficult to see the father, so I'll point at the father, is standing here with his arm on, on the shoulder of his wife, who's sobbing and praying at a small table in the corner. Just a step back from this, Sir Henry Tate commissioned this painting from Luke Fildes, and the subject was left to Fildes' own discretion, and Fildes chose a personal tragedy of his own. In 1877, his first son, Philip Luke, had died at the age of 1, and this painting was inspired by the professional devotion of the doctor who treated his son, Dr. Gustavus Murray. Fildes chose a rustic interior, and he created that, he built that in his studio with the window on the right against the window of the studio, and Fildes would get up before dawn every morning so he could accurately portray the look of dawn breaking through the window. And let me read what Fildes himself wrote. At the cottage window, the dawn begins to steal in, the dawn that is the critical time of all deadly illnesses. And with it, the parents again take hope into their hearts. The mother hiding her face to escape giving vent to her emotions, the father laying his hand on the shoulder of his wife in encouragement of the first glimmerings of the joy which is to follow. So clearly, Fildes, in this case, has painted a child that is expected to recover. And if a child could make it through the night till dawn, Victorians believed that, and it was found that the child would often recover. The child has had medicine during the night. You can see prescriptions still scattered on the floor. It's a poor family. The child is sleeping on 2 chairs put together. The doctor has been giving her medicine. You can see the cup he's been dispensing it from, and you can see the medicine on the table on the left. Now, this was painted by Fildes, and Henry Tate paid Fildes £3,000 for the painting. It was extremely popular when it was engraved, and the print sold more than 1 million copies in America alone. It was sold around the world, and it was found on most people's walls. It was the most successful print that the printers Agnews had ever produced. When Henry Tate died, he donated this picture and 55 others as a gift to the nation. And in 1897, the Tate Gallery, as it was later called, opened with this painting and others that were donated. So let me go on to talk about the Victorian family, a key unit in the Victorian society. And Queen Victoria used the family unit as a propaganda tool, essentially. She presented herself as monarch and mother combined. She had 9 children in 14 years. She set family values at the heart of her image that she presented both through engravings of these paintings and later photography. And middle-class parents looked to her as an example. Queen Victoria, in fact, helped develop the modern idea of childhood. Or at least she, before Albert died in 1861, she showed her close-knit, or what appeared to be a close-knit and happy family. It was to some extent propaganda, as we know Queen Victoria actually disliked babies and young children. And this was a time when the wealthy and even middle-class children were often very strictly brought up and distanced from their parents by nursemaids and governesses. Interestingly, we know from testimonies that many working class families were much closer knit and more loving. In those families, children were often pleased to work to earn a few pennies to help the family unit. I'm not including, of course, those children I've been talking about who were forced to work in dangerous conditions. And although this became increasingly unacceptable in the Victorian period, it still continued to the end of the century and beyond. This painting itself, the painting was hung in the dining room of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, but it was also engraved for public circulation as a form of propaganda. Let's look at a middle-class family. Here, celebrating a child's birthday. The child is sitting in the center of the painting and in fact looking out at us. And she's surrounded by a wreath. That was the convention. And it's a celebration of her 6th birthday. And increasingly, Victorians would celebrate milestones in a child's life, important events to be recorded. The little girl is in the place of honor, but all attention, you can look at the women on the left, all attention is focused on the man of the family. The man is actually a self-portrait of the artist William Powell Frith, and this is called Many Happy Returns of the Day. The man is waiting. The etiquette is that he can't raise a toast to his daughter until his father, shown on the far right, has received a glass which the little girl is just about to give him, and the father will then raise a toast to the young girl. The father, of course, was the central person in Victorian families. Now, in the case of Frith himself, it appears that his family wasn't quite as happy as this one. Frith led, what should I call it, an unusual domestic life. He was married to a woman called Isabel, and they had 12 children, while at the same time, a mile down the road, he had a mistress called Mary Alford, and she was also his ward and nursemaid to the family, and he had another 7 children by her. Now, his wife Isabel didn't know about Mary Alford, but one day she caught Frith down the road posting a letter when he was meant to be in Brighton, and it all came out. In marked contrast to the upright Victorian family shown in this scene was the reality of adultery by the husband. But as we shall see on the next picture we look at, it was a very different story if it was adultery by the wife. In fact, this painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy the day Mary Alford's first baby was born, the very day. And when his wife Isabel died, he married Mary Alford, and the affair became public knowledge. So let's look at what happened to the children following adultery by the wife. And I've taken a painting by Augustus Egg, and in fact, this is one of 3 paintings. I'm just showing you the first, called Past and Present, number 1, Misfortune. And the theme of this painting is the discovery of the wife's infidelity and its consequences. Now, the wife lies prostrate at her husband's feet, with her bracelets looking like handcuffs. Her husband sits grimly at the table, and their children have constructed a house of cards in the background, which you can see is just collapsing. The husband is holding a letter, evidence, we are to presume, of his wife's adultery, and simultaneously he's crushing a miniature of her lover under his foot. The setting is an ordinary middle-class drawing room, but close observation reveals it's full of symbols that have been put there by Augustus Egg. The children's cards are supported by a novel by Balzac, a specialist in the theme of adultery. An apple you can see on the center of the table has been cut in half, and the worm-eaten half is lying on the floor below, representing his wife. And the other half is stabbed through the core, representing the husband. The 2 pictures on the wall behind depict on the left the expansion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, labelled The Fall, and a shipwreck by Clarkson Stanfield, labelled Abandoned. And underneath each picture, it's quite difficult to see, but underneath there are the couple's individual portraits hanging beneath the appropriate image. And in the background, there's a picture, there's a mirror, and in the mirror, we see reflected the open door, which denotes the woman's impending departure from the home. And just to make that completely clear, the second of the 3 paintings shows the 2 girls as teenagers 5 years later, poor and living on their own. And in the catalogue, it tells us their father has just died of a broken heart. And the 3rd picture in the sequence shows the mother holding a baby. We just see its legs and feet, close to death, under an arch next to Waterloo Bridge. In fact, I should just add, before I go on, a quote from an early feminist. And of course, in Victorian England, a man could generally safely take a mistress without fear of recrimination, but for a woman to be unfaithful was unforgivable. As the early feminists wrote, the faults of women are visited as sins, the sins of men are not even visited as faults. So just briefly, the role of women, and bringing up children was obviously one of the role. This shows the conventional role of the conventional view of the three roles of a respectable woman. And this is made clear in a poem written by Coventry Patmore called The Angel in the House. The wife was regarded as pure, unworldly, innocent. And here we see the three roles: on the left, guide of childhood, and at the center, companion of manhood, and on the right, comfort of old age. This isn't a time sequence. The woman might be doing all three at the same time, looking after her children, comforting her husband, who incidentally in this central painting has just received news of a death in the family. We know that from the black around the letter he's holding. And on the right, the woman might be looking after her father at the same time. This, of course, could lead to an interesting discussion about the feminist ideal of the new woman that emerged a long time before the suffragettes in the second half of the 19th century, and it rejected all forms of domination by men. But my theme today is children. So let's move on to the next painting, which is about a young lady, but also her what's probably her younger brother. And we can guess that because the young lady is wearing mourning clothes, and so probably her parents have just died, because we see she's seeking to sell a painting that she has painted using one of the skills she's learned as a middle-class woman. So we imagine that both her parents have died, and in that case, there's no easy way for a woman to earn money. The conventional view was that a woman who wasn't being supported by a male breadwinner would turn to prostitution or some other form of being a kept woman. And this is possibly indicated by the leers of the two men on the left, who understand the difficult position she was in. However, we now believe that between 1850 and this was painted in 1857 and 1870, 30 to 40% of women worked. Now, this is a higher percentage than at any time until after World War II, but women's jobs were not recorded in the census for a variety of reasons, partly because we don't think their work was seen as central to the family, and partly their employment may have, or recording their employment in the census may have undermined the manliness of the so-called breadwinner. But women would help with the family business. They might have worked part-time domestic servants, worked in a local textile mill. They might be shop assistants, working confectionery or brewing, seamstresses, laundry work, cleaning, and so on. But there was one job that was, or in fact, many jobs, but one in particular here that it was difficult for women to enter, and that was to become a professional artist. But it wasn't impossible. You might have noticed that the artist here is Emily Osborne. And so although it was difficult, it was possible, and a few women did become professional artists, few as successful as Emily Osborne. She, the first year she exhibited her paintings at the Royal Academy, she sold one for £200 to the Queen, and she continued to exhibit at the Royal Academy virtually every year until close to her death, which wasn't till 1925. So in the remaining few slides, I look at ways in which the modern idea of childhood developed, and it developed first within the more wealthy families. This, as I told you before, is a painting called Bubbles by John Everett Millais. It's his grandson, Willie James, and Millais saw his grandson blowing bubbles one day and thought it would make an engaging subject. Now, shortly after he finished the painting, his son tells us in Millet's biography that a friend from the Illustrated London News visited and bought the painting. Now, Millet sold it to him because the paper had bought many other paintings by him previously and faithfully reproduced them in the paper, and they got wide circulation. So Millet had no concerns about his fate. However, in this case, the paper sold the rights to the manufacturer of Pear's soap, who modified the image and used it for a long-running and successful advertising campaign, as you see here. Now, Millet was furious, but he had no say in the matter. He'd sold the copyright, and unsympathetic critics who didn't know the background saw it as a terrible blight, a detrimental to both art and the artist. The painting itself, incidentally, if we return to the original painting by Millet, is a vanitas painting. That is, it's about death and the beauty and fragility of life as represented by the bubble, and the plant in the background representing life, and the broken pot on the left representing death, as well as the short period of life that we all live, represented by the bubble. But I imagine that most people who saw the soap advertisement saw it as a picture of an attractive child blowing bubbles. The child, incidentally, became Admiral Sir William Milbourne James, and he grew up to become a naval commander, politician, and author, and he died aged 91 in 1973. This painting, though, haunted him most of his life, and he was nicknamed Bubbles in the Navy. I don't know whether they called him Bubbles to his face when he was an admiral, though. Another painting by Millet. This is Millet's 5-year-old daughter, Effie, and she's sitting to attention in a church, one of the old high-backed pews in All Saints Church, Kingston-on-Thames. And Millet actually hurried to paint it because the pews, the old pews, were shortly removed after this was painted. The Art Journal wrote, "One of the happiest works this artist has ever painted." And it was very successful, both the painting at the Royal Academy and as a print. And a year later, Millet painted a companion piece showing the same little girl, his daughter Effie, after the novelty of the sermon had worn off. Now, in a speech at the Royal Academy banquet, the Archbishop of Canterbury claimed it was a warning against the evil of lengthy sermons and drowsy discourses. So art historians who have analysed many Victorian paintings of children have concluded that it shows how adults during this period started to develop a new fascination with childhood. And there was a strong cultural desire to idealize children and turn them into objects of beauty, as we see here. And also, as we see, they are often identified with faith and innocence. And it's seen, childhood is seen as an increasingly special period, made poignant through its brevity. Children are shown as adorable, as here, but also vulnerable, requiring vigilant adult concern and protection from a harsh world. And the overall effect is that children became objects onto which male fantasies of innocence, morality, faith, and nostalgia were projected. Let me move on to one of my second to last paintings. With increasing wealth, there was increasing leisure time. And what this meant was there was more time with the children. And with the reduction in train fares that took place, and with train railway lines spreading right across the country, it meant that holidays could be taken with the children. Now, there's a lot going on in this painting. In fact, my supervisor at the Courtauld, Professor Caroline Arscott, wrote some 50 pages in her PhD dissertation about this painting, and she analysed every character in the painting, but I would just like to pick out a couple. Amongst all the hustle and bustle we see, there is an amusing incident right over on the left. Let me point to the child over here, this one, in the green dress. It's a small boy looking through a telescope, and you'll see behind him to the right, there's a seated old man also looking through a telescope. The boy is mimicking his action. But what is the man looking at so intently? Well, look at the expression of his wife. The clue is the bathing machines over here on the right. The stare from his wife suggests he's scrutinizing the female bathers as they exit the bathing machines. They would have worn, of course, long woolen bathing costumes, which they changed into in the bathing machine. Although I would say that at this time, it's reported that men would still bathe naked, and poor women from London who would travel to Ramsgate by train would also bathe naked. I mean, they couldn't afford a bathing machine. So maybe it's them he's looking at. So my final picture in the evolution of childhood shows a picture which could be a modern middle-class family with the mother bringing in Christmas pudding. The mother's looking at her daughter. The daughter's filling her father's glass with beer. The two boys are eagerly awaiting the pudding. The dinner plates have been cleared. No food remains on them. It's all been eaten. And the housekeeper is ready to serve everyone on clean plates. You can see in front of her, there's a Christmas tree behind her, mistletoe, holly over the mantelpiece, but the focus is on the food, as it was in the 18th century, but now the children are the center of attention, whereas in the 18th century, Christmas didn't revolve around children, it revolved around adults who held parties and feasts. It was during the Victorian period that gradually children became the center of family activities, family festivities, such as Christmas. And finally, to return to my first two pictures, I would like to bring you back to the first point I made and end with a quote from a book on child labor during the Industrial Revolution. In 1880, the Compulsory Education Act helped reduce the number of child laborers, and subsequent laws raised their age and made working conditions safer. But it had come too late for the little white slaves on whose blood, sweat, and toil our great railways, bridges, and buildings of the Industrial Revolution were built. Thank you for your attention.